Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Sanjay, for inviting me here. Now, I'm going to talk about the pharmaceutical provisions in the TPP and what there are implications for very niche areas of Indo-Japan trade in generics for that. And before I begin, I would like to begin with a caveat that for a document that was released only this month, which spans over 30 chapters and 2,700 pages, the attempt here is not to tell you how it will play out, what's the strategy, and should India join it or not. Rather, it will just give you an insight into a very niche area and some ideas to juggle to. Now, I would like to talk about TPP from the perspective of not it being as an agreement, but as an approach, which has two critical elements. The first being what has come to be called as forum shift, where you pursue an overarching agenda by not betting at a single international forum, but as a risk hedging strategy, you negotiate at several international forums to say not putting all your eggs in a single basket. The move from the multilateral platform of WTO and moving from that to several regional and bilateral negotiations suggests such a movement. When you couple this forum shift along with a template approach, where every successive negotiation sets a benchmark for the next round of negotiations, and again to pursue an overarching agenda here, intellectual property being the case. Now, when you couple these two elements, you get a very successful strategy, which has culminated into TPP, where you have ratcheted up the IP provisions by a spate of FTAs being negotiated, precisely 20 FTAs led by US. The move started with Jordan in 2000, then 2004 with Morocco, and then in 2007 with Peru, with Colombia, with Panama, Australia, then Korea, and finally we are seeing TTIP, and TTIP is the next move. Now, what TPP does precisely in this area is it has changed the connotation of how liberalization is defined in the neoclassical tradition, which classically means bringing in more competition, bringing in more firms into the fray. Here, the new connotation is bringing in and prolonging monopolies to seek monopolistic rents. Now, see, if you put on a scale of 1 to 10, TRIPS, which is the mother lode of all the IP provisions that the world follows, if you place it at 1, and the other extreme at 10, you place TRIPS plus, the TRIPS plus agenda. TPP, I can tell you, is a significant shift from the TRIPS to TRIPS plus, but it's not TRIPS plus itself. If somebody argues that it's TRIPS plus, then the world is yet to see a TRIPS plus plus, so to say. Now, because there have been, since the negotiations started, there have been leaks in almost every year, 6 months. We have been seeing leaks of the drafts of the IP chapter. Now, it's interesting. The first leaks had very language that was very aggressive, and by the time the negotiations have been completed, the last leak and the final draft, you see that on practically all the provisions in pharmaceutical provisions in IP, there has been, the language is couched in a diplomatic compromise. That's why I'm saying it's not TRIPS plus, it's TRIPS. But this would certainly enhance monopolies in the patent space in pharmaceuticals. Now, this being the backdrop, the case of Indo-Japan trade is interesting, particularly Japan. Now, Japan, their health is a subject. It's for a Japanese citizen, it's just like air and water. The moment you touch health, you are certainly going to face electoral heat in the next round of elections. Now, I happened to be in Japan earlier this year, and I talked to a lot of stakeholders there, and especially people in the health ministry, and all of them told me that health as it exists today is not going to sustain, because the demographic profile, a rapidly aging society, uh, because it's practically omnipresent, everybody is covered, it's not going to sustain, the budgets are squeezing, so it needs a lot of reform. Now, what TPP does to this situation is it would act as a catalyst to further bring in more reforms in Japan, because simply as it stands today, it's not sustainable, and TPP will further bring in more reforms to the system. So what this does is it brings a renewed perspective to generics, which have been largely neglected. To put things in perspective, 80% of the prescriptions filled in US are generics. The same is not true for Japan. It's less than 30%. It's due to cultural skepticism. It's due to what happened between Daiichi and Ranbaxy. There are a number of reasons. But simply the Japanese consumers are not using generics right now to the extent they can. The companies, only Lupin is the only company that has been able to make significant inroads to the pharmaceutical market in Japan. We are practically exporting nothing to Japan right now in the pharmaceutical space, but apart from some API, the final products are not being exported. Sun Pharmaceuticals is looking at Japan as an inorganic route to acquire companies in Japan. Now, the market is placed in a position that South Korea, China, India, all three, which are not part of TPP right now, are supplying almost 50% of the raw materials to manufacture pharmaceuticals to Japan. Now, what TPP does is it equally erodes all the competitive advantages that these three countries hold. So, it's a space that is being created, and especially post the patent cliff, which is, patent cliff, by the way, is an interesting phenomena that almost 30 to 50 drugs are going off patent in this particular decade. Again, to put things in perspective, when Lipitor went off patent in 2011, Pfizer lost $12 billion worth of constant revenue streams. So multiply that by 50 and you get the potential size of the patent cliff. That's the market that's going to be available for the generics in this decade itself. So all I'm saying is that what TPP does is, if you choose to hop on the bandwagon, there are opportunity costs. The domestic industry is going to face the heat. But if you choose to be an innocent bystander, there are costs there as well. So it's something to look into. There are low-hanging fruits till the time we hop on that bandwagon, and they should be exploited. Thank you.